Thank you so much, Akshay. We can give one more round of applause for Akshay for all the work he's doing in the space. Thank you. Our next speaker, you may have seen just a few moments ago up on the screen. He is one of the key advisors for Blockchain India. Mr. Nitin Gaur, he is the head of IBM Blockchain Labs. He founded Blockchain Labs, and then now he's heading up IBM Digital Asset Labs. He is focused on enterprise adoption in the blockchain space. And I was just talking to him right before, and he's from right here in Bangalore. So actually his parents are here, so he can visit. So he was homegrown here, right in Bangalore. So we're really lucky to have him so he can share about his journey of how he went from here and made it to work in one of the top positions at IBM. And he's also been traveling in over more than 140 countries. So if we can please give a warm welcome to Mr. Nitin Gaur.
I have the mic. Thank you so much, Jessica. I think you stole my thunder. I was going to say I'm from Bangalore, but that's okay. Hi, my name is Nitin. Really happy to be here. One, this is my home. I grew up here. I left when I was 14, and I do want to thank Akshay for all the perseverance in terms of making this possible. I think this is a journey, right? I think this is a good beginning. And my involvement in Indian DevFest or in your initiatives that you're leading is twofold. One is I think it's a give back. I'm from here, and I think I have a vested interest in this great country for us to be able to think beyond what we have been doing so far, right? And I'm happy to share some of that experience in terms of what I've seen globally and what we want to achieve, in India. With that, I do want to sort of talk about a few things. My agenda it's packed agenda. It's really about almost 6 years of my experience with building teams and delivering projects and what we've seen, what has failed. And I talk about bridging the trust divide. Essentially, this is the constant debate we have between the enterprise space, which is the permission world, and the decentralized or the permissionless space. And I think we see sort of, at least from my perspective, we see that there's this dichotomy today, but eventually, this is the convergence. This is all the Web 3.0, all the new society that we talk about. So I want you to take away a few things. Of course, not every slide is important, but look at the summary of what we're trying to achieve here, right? And towards the end, I do have a message from my visibility and what I've worked with various companies in the world for us as the Indian leaders that we are in the room to think about a few things as to how do we progress the agenda here, right? So just in terms of, I think we should move this next slide, where few things we're trying to solve, right? Between Game of Thrones and all the TV shows and our day jobs, we only have so much time in the day. So there's something we're trying to solve with blockchain. What is it, right? Fundamentally, it boils down to these two constructs, time and trust. I want you to keep that in mind because oftentimes we're using blockchain as, of course, beyond the cocktail parties and labeling it wherever we want to, make an impact. We're trying to solve for these two things fundamentally. And these two constructs have enormous impact in many industries. Whether you're moving money, you're moving containers, you're figuring out, so it's more than just moving from this asynchronous dissemination of information to a synchronous dissemination of information, which most databases can do. It's really about moving value. And if the value leads to all of us who have bank accounts, who have investments, you realize that we are paying a massive sum every year because of opacity of information, opacity of data, opacity of various participants in that network. And trust, again, is a fee. You're paying a massive cost because you trust various entities, hoping that the transfer of value, whether it's from you to someone else or from someone else to you or between parties, between companies, happens on time, happens with trust, and the cost of non-compliance, cost of fraud is massive. So this is all the primary drivers that are going after enormous amount of use cases that we're seeing in the industry. So what I want you to think about is, again, I've used this as a litmus test for most use cases. I've had use cases from all over the map in terms of using blockchain to solve all problems. I oftentimes go back to basics, going back to figuring out, does this problem require the solving of time and trust? If not, we have enough tech already to be able to solve those issues. So there's something you should take away, at least in my opinion. Simple slide, but to me this message has been profound and it has been a guiding principle from the past 6 years working with the enterprise space. I want to throw some numbers out, and some of the numbers are dated by design. It's about 3 years back I put the numbers together, and I still go back to it. What's interesting to IBM or to tech companies or startup companies is a 2.3 billion number. That's the tech spend. That's what we are after, and that number has gone up. I think I just read the Gartner report yesterday, the $3.1 trillion worth of economic potential is there in this whole thing. You look at 10% of GDP, which is, again, the source of this is World Economic Forum, IBM Business Value, Business of, BIS stats, and so on and so forth. And eventually, the interesting number is 70% of banks will release a blockchain application by 2017. We see that happening. Visa announced B2B Connect yesterday. We've been working with them for almost 5 years. You see JPM Coin, you see Goldman Sachs. There's all these projects that are happening around the globe, but I don't believe that 17% number is accurate, but at some point, how do you disprove it? What's interesting is not the tech spend, not what the banks will do, where the GDP will go. What's interesting to me, and should be for you as entrepreneurs and leaders, is this $176 billion number. It's figuring out where we're going with this. What is the economic value that doesn't exist today? What is the economic value that we can exploit as business leaders? What doesn't exist today? What are the markets that we're creating? Right? And I'll give you a few examples of where things are. And this is, again, I've related this so much to the dot-com era and the internet era, where a lot of economic models, business models didn't exist, and yet we had this enormous explosion in economic activity. I wanted to think in those terms, that it's less about just using blockchain as a label and rattling off the consensus mechanism and talking about which is better, which is not. I think it's about this new interaction model, new business model that emanates from this notion of co-creation that happens on a network. I'll spend some more time on that as we progress. So what is it? We talk about blockchain as decentralized platform. To me, all of them are true. It's a trusted digital transaction platform. We are doing transactions, which means I'm not using the database. I'm not using blockchain as a vehicle for me to be able to move data in all these different directions. It's about trust, right? It is about transactional element of it. It is platform for disintermediation. We've seen that with information networks. We don't have travel agents. How many of you book by travel agents, by the way? Good, we don't. You, one guy? One time, one travel agent, that's good. I was hoping not to see any hands up. But I'm just joking, of course. But the point is that the green skins are gone. The people who are brokers between us and the Sabre and the various systems that do reservations for us are gone. We have bridged the gap with information networks. So it is a platform for disintermediation, which means somebody will be disintermediated, but then you have newer economic models that are going to come from it. It's a co-creation element. We are trying to figure out synergies between this massive network. So you're not only creating a blockchain network, you're creating a marketplace of sorts. Trying to figure out as to who can talk to who and who can create new business value from the mere interaction of those transaction transaction that happens, and multi-party network. So the question you're asking me is, Nitin, we already have digital marketplaces. We have Amazon, we have eBay, we have Flipkart, we have all these things. But yes, that's true. But if you look at the inefficiencies, going back to time and trust, the cost element of it, it's enormous. It's enormous not only for the fact that you're buying a few things here that may be sourced in many different countries, but you are, at the end of the day, paying a price for it. And in many cases, you are becoming sort of the conduit of a massive fraud scheme that happens behind the scenes because you're fueling the entire shipping and movement of goods across the globe. We'll get to that in a minute. So what happens in terms of, I think we missed a few slides that I was trying to talk about, but I had a few humor bits in this where we had the journey of talking about where blockchain started as, we all talk about, look, how much power this blockchain consumes. This is about 4 or 5 years back. Well, you haven't even gone to quantum computing yet to have that conversation. So we start from that whole element of power consumption, going back to, look, Bitcoin is there, and then say, let's focus on blockchain, not Bitcoin. There's a whole journey, and I had a few memes that was there in the slide that I wanted to present. But this is sort of a summary of what me and my global teams, I have 17 labs across the globe, and we're launching this journey as a blockchain company, is figuring out as to what are the use cases that make sense. So these are the use cases that me and my global teams have been working across the globe, where the industry, there's a massive investment come from the industry as well as the industry leaders to be able to understand the values. There was a whole process where we went through this POC and MVP phase, and 90% of them failed, but now figuring out as to where the real money is, essentially. So keep this in mind, because this list is growing, but after all the validation, all the failures, all the elements of what has worked and what has not worked, what has economic value and what doesn't have economic value, we came up with these list of sort of use cases that went after it. There's a massive technology play behind it, so don't underestimate the role of tech. I was sitting in one corner and I was listening to some folks talking about consensus mechanism. Those are really, really important topics. So don't discount those, but I think what's important is figuring out the use cases that has economic value and make economic sense. Some of the elements that I want to talk about, these are the use cases. So this is something which is referenceable clients that we have in place, where some of the references that we begin to see is massive work. Digital trade finance, there are about close to 8 to 9 production networks that are going towards trade finance elements. And it has literally a multi-trillion-dollar impact on the existing system today. We look into capital markets, we look into government. Again, Akshay and me have spoken enormously at length on Niti Aayog, Aadhaar card, which is first step is digitalization, which is done. But how do we effectively use it? We link that with Estonia, and I am an e-citizen of Estonia because, of course, we have to do all these experiments. I was able to open a bank account. I was able to open a startup before I even stepped on into Estonia. And I've been to Estonia. It's a really small country, good food, good tourism. But it allows us to be able to do these things where you're going after this, again, new society, being able to provide this country as a service model, right? And country as a service model is really powerful that suddenly I'm able to participate in this global economic system as an American and as an Indian, of course, where I should be able to create all these ecosystems and be a part of it, which any one of us with some basic level of credential, with our Aadhaar card, should be able to participate in that global economic system, which today a farmer in India, and I've been to remote parts of India to understand the real challenges of mobile payments when I was driving mobile payments, is its identity. We talk about financial inclusion, we talk about all these cases. I think a farmer in many rural parts of India have basic problems. So I don't think they really care about digital fiat or digital identity. It's about 3 meals a day and having power and having clean water. So the idea there is figuring out these use cases, and there are many governments, Dubai included, notably Dubai and many of the European countries, Zug in Switzerland, focusing on those fundamental infrastructure that's needed as a scaffolding before we begin to build this digital ecosystem on top of it. So this is remember the 176 billion problem that we're talking about, where you begin to see, like, on what you see on the right-hand side is something that we are working with VTrade, which is a sort of a global trade finance network, which is purely for banking functions. So remember, we are talking about digital asset, so you have a defined asset type in a network, and those assets essentially have to be exchanged. So you can't really create a system which has multiple asset types, and because you have rules and you have governance and you have smart contracts, you have all these things which allow us to have a more singular use case addressed in a network. So what you see on the right-hand side is VTrade, which is our facilitating SME, small mid enterprise, to move their goods with ease and have visibility and be able to generate money from it. And what you see on the left-hand side is our work with Maersk. And now you have 3 other large shipping lines who have joined that network. So think about this, right? We are trying to digitize and create this digital asset of these containers that move across the globe. So you're moving goods, and you're creating a network that moves money. Foundation and fundamental of any economic system is movement of goods and money. That's what we're doing. So you have a blockchain system that allows you to be able to do those, but they're not linked. And there are technical reasons, there are maturity reasons today why they're not linked. But what's more interesting is the resulting ecosystem that's emerging from it. The ability for me to have newer product from financial services, to have working capital loans, to have supply chain loans. You need to have inventory financing loans, to provide fractional release of assets as the goods have reached a certain point, because you have de-risked some of those elements, because we have visibility of asset movement in those networks. So you see, if I have information and I have movement of asset, the ability for me to be able to repurpose my warehouse, repurpose my liquidity to be able to address these new products, that market doesn't exist today. And that's what we talk about. And this is a really small subsect of a use case. If we expand that to capital markets, we expand that to mortgage-backed security, you can suddenly see how this begins to balloon up. So think blockchain, not just tech or consensus mechanisms, or look, we can put this all on one network and we can transact. Think about the co-creation element of those synergies that don't exist today, or we cannot, because of opacity of information, opacity of value as it moves to the system. So this is all the world that I live in. And I had another interesting video that talked about, could you play that video? Do we have time for that? The first one. So this is it's a meme. I just want to have some humor because blockchain conversation is really dry and boring at times. So there's a short video that talks about typical blockchain conversation where we drop in some of these words. And if not, it's okay, we can move it. Don't have time for that. What's happening is in enterprise.
Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer digital currency.
Okay. We can go back. Okay, let's play this for like just 30 seconds.
It's
This is
anonymous and it's decentralized. It's like being able to teleport money to anyone across the world. No, I think it's actually being teleported. It's a way of making millions of peers to track each and every Bitcoin on a public ledger called the blockchain. When you want to send someone a Bitcoin, you publicly announce that your account is sending a Bitcoin to the recipient's account. Since it leverages a public record, everyone knows Bitcoins are associated with each account and prevents anyone from spending money that isn't there. In the old days, you have banks to hold on for money, and they keep it locked up, make sure bandits didn't ride off with it. Since Bitcoin only exists as a record on the blockchain, there's nothing to keep banks on guard. All that matters is your private key, the cryptographic calculator that you access your account and save money from.
Vince Clortho, Keymaster of Gozer.
As long as your account is key, no one can steal our Bitcoin.
Yeah. So you get the point, right? This is the typical conversation that we go through when you have the highlights of the words: blockchain, Bitcoin, private keys, hashing ledger, and everything else is just gone in the background. And I think this is a typical conversation we used to have for a while back, where it was just interesting and funny because nothing of substance came out of it. But my story is, until now, I talked about where the enterprise, this is the establishment that we all have been working for 30 plus or 100 plus years, trying to figure out how to transform the industry. But then you have a really interesting space, which is the decentralized crypto space, what we call as crypto world. And I'll tell you this, it all started here. So it's not wise or feasible for the enterprise people, which is my people, to ignore, that's right, my people for now, I'm still representing the enterprise world as long as I'm with IBM. But the point there is that there's a whole slew of innovation ecosystem happening here from technology space, from business model space. There's a whole, of course, some of it is bubble, some of it is just fad, but there's a lot of nuggets of information of new economic models, from ICO to STO, figuring out as to how do we sort of exchange value and how do we create secondary markets, make our DAO. You talk about decentralized, autonomous organizations, what they have done with collateralizing debt on crypto world. It's an amazing world that you don't want to miss. What's interesting is, this is also a dated slide, that for every single use case that I talked about, for every single sort of a subset of use case talked about, there's a disruptor who's out there to get you, which is the establishment, including us. So what you see in the protocol and infrastructure space, every single one of them competes with us, with our clients, going forward and doing it. What that means for us is that no matter who you work for, and no matter what you're doing, there's always some entity trying to be able to disrupt the elements. So there's an enterprise world that's going towards transformation, and there's an enterprise world that's going towards disruption. And to me, this is really, really attractive world where what I compare, and this is the divide I'm talking about, that world is moving too fast, and for me to be able to consume it, I'm happy to steal all the innovation happening in zero knowledge world, for example, privacy preservation, figuring out how to manage identity, taking sovereign foundation, applying that to enterprise, and I can rattle off all these little things, but what's interesting is, can I not bridge that divide between what's happening in this world until the crypto norms and crypto standards and crypto concepts or around crypto assets and economics become acceptable, right? So what you see on the left-hand side is there's a blockchain for every single industry, figuring out where the transformative energy is, figuring out on the right-hand side as to what is the innovation happening in that space, and going after the convergence model where we head with it. I have a few more minutes. I'm just going to go into a few more slide agendas. We've talked about tokenizing everything, but there's a last mile problem, which is no matter what you do, most demos you've seen, most elements you've seen is, yes, I've tokenized this, I've moved asset from point A to point B, but you don't sell a house or a car or anything without you get something in return. There's a duality to that transaction where we begin to now look into the finality of the settlement. So while blockchain can do finality of transaction, to achieve the finality of the transaction, we have to look into finality of the settlement piece, which is at the end of the day, it's the cash. Cash is the king, right? So there are all these elements working with central banks, the JPMC, the stablecoin ecosystem that's emerging, is to what do we do to digitize cash? Because it doesn't matter if I can move things of value, tokenize assets, and move it left and right. I still have to wait for SWIFT rails or traditional banking rails and RTGS, MPLS, whatever the case is, to be able to move forward. And most countries may have faster payment domestically, like India does. But when you start moving cross-border, you go back, hit the same problem of time and trust. It's the massive cost of participating in that ecosystem. So there's a lot of work happening in this space where we look into new currencies, new complexities, and having crypto asset adds to that complexity. And so I figured there's just too much going on. So I want to go back to basics. I don't want to boil the ocean. I don't want to take human resource applications and see how blockchain can help with the referral bonuses. And that's a real use case that came to our attention and we said you can just manage it with a spreadsheet unless you have a massive employee churn problem. And if that's the case, blockchain is not your biggest problem. It's employee morale that's your biggest problem, for instance. But the idea there is that going back to fundamentals, trade, trust, ownership, so 3 pillars of blockchain which solves those issues of time and trust. Going after addressing duality of a transaction. This is a technical problem that I'm dealing with 2 different asset classes. Cash is a different asset class, and so is your car. They're fungible because cash makes it fungible, but how do you ensure that you're trying to create that from an asset perspective? Going after figuring out how do we create digital asset in the system? How does the digital asset derive value? And again, going after, if we are simply solving reconciliation, this Nostro, Vostro, and database problems, then what are we really solving? And I want to go back after 4 or 5 years of that work and say, this is not exactly what we are doing this for, so we have to take a bit more serious approach towards going after it. So my focus for 2019, and this has been my focus in the past 2.5 years, and I laid out these 6 things. If you're an entrepreneur, if you're working with a company, if you're being a consultant, I believe that these 6 pillars are essential, and this is something which I think Akshay and we've talked a lot in terms of Blockchain India references. What do we do with it? Digital identity is fundamental. I cannot take an asset and assign that to Aadhaar card. You have to have a digital identity which is tied to you as a non-fungible asset. So digital identity becomes a foundational element of it. Digital fiat is the last mile problem. So there are 2 parts of that equation where I have the digital identity which basically lets me participate in the digital ecosystem, and I have digital asset, and each of them have its own nuances. One is there's no value to my identity except that value is immense to me but for nobody else. But the digital asset has some value somewhere from someplace. Asset tokenization. I've been at this for almost 3 years, solving those problems. How do we tokenize an asset in the permission world? In the permissionless world, there's crypto economics, there are elements that you can create, but how do we sort of make sure we have the same checks and balances that the decentralized world has into the permissioned world that we're creating? And then the remaining 3 of them are technical issues. Cybersecurity risk really goes up high. And who do you go after when things are stolen, taken away? You can go after a bank. There's regulation in every country that protects you and me as consumers. And the last thing, my friends, is the single most reason why most blockchain networks have not gone to production: governance. Governance model is the reason why I have gray hair, which I used to be a younger looking guy about 4 years back, started working in blockchain world. That's what's keeping all of us up at night in terms of making this real from a perspective of enterprise and perspective of mass adoption. We all need to know how do we engage, how do we behave. So I'm going to leave it at 2 more things. And all this is, you connect with me on LinkedIn. Not that I'm shamefully trying to grow my network. I'm good on that. The point there is I've written a paper on these topics in terms of some design consideration. As you go and look into blockchain, just don't be enamored with the underlying consensus or Ethereum versus Bitcoin versus EOS or XYZ. Look into some of the elements of what you're building, what problems you're solving, what are the end goals that you're trying to achieve, and tech elements comes a bit later. Again, each of these slides have a paper dedicated to them, where this is how we go in the enterprise world, is figuring out the right use case. So if there's no money behind the use case, then there's no economic model, which means your use case will die after a POC. Trust me on this, 98% of my use cases have been dead because we didn't do economic analysis before. And then we figure out the business blueprint, who are the participants, who pays for the network, who is the beneficiary of the overall system, who benefits from it, what are the co-creation elements. And then comes the tech piece. I'm saying this because I'm one of you. As Indians, we love tech. We love to be able to go into complex situations and be able to solve it. I believe that in most cases, we realize that tech comes way towards the end of the entire equation, where we begin to look into the right cryptography, the right algorithms, the right network module, the right security elements that go with it. And then eventually the biggest problem, the reason why I think this is all goes back to governance, is the enterprise has legacy. You have to integrate with existing systems, which is the most expensive part of the entire blockchain project. So with that, a shameful plug, and again, I'm not trying to make money from selling books. We, 3 of us, spend a lot of time in taking this learning from the field from past 6 years, created models of risk model framework, business model frameworks, technology frameworks. So if you're a business leader, I would imagine you would have some foundational knowledge. At the same time, you'd have some litmus tests, some metrics to be able to measure these things and to be able to make sense of them. So we try to incorporate them. I published another book last year on Hyperledger Fabric, because that's what our focus was at the time. And I realized that tech books, one, have short shelf life. Once Hyperledger 2.0 comes out, what we did in 1.4 becomes pointless. So we had to create a timeless book which allows us to be able to refer back as a reference model to go back and doing it. So with that, I know there's a last video which is like less than 30 seconds, which just talks about the journey of what we went through on this book. If you could play that. But while that's coming on the board, I do want to, again, thank the organizers, thank Akshay and the chain, Manav, especially good people, good, they have the right, heart in the right place, and hopefully you'll never get back this 30 minutes or 35 minutes, but hope this was worth your time, and hope you can get more from this. I'll say one last thing while the video is coming up, is India, my home, and I have very strong roots to this country. Even though we all live abroad, we represent as two.
When you think about
Go ahead.
blockchains, you probably think of some far-off digital utopia where the magic of shared ledgers makes life easier for everyone. But that magic is already happening. Blockchain is not the technology of the future, it's creating disruptive opportunities now. In the US, a major consumer goods company uses blockchain to verify and trust its advertising metrics across platforms, knowing exactly how consumers go from impression to buyer with perfect transparency. A Chinese bank lets their credit card users spend bonus points anywhere, using blockchain to centralize transactions and avoid costly systems integrations. Another large company uses blockchain to streamline accounts payable, cutting processing time from 5 days to 1 day and trimming costs by 50%. Businesses around the globe are already realizing the process transformation, cost savings, and new business models that blockchain promises. So how do you begin? Check out Blockchains for Business for practical steps in implementing blockchains. Available now.
Yeah, so I was going to finish this thought that coming from here, I think you laid out this really well up front. It's about ecosystems, it's not about tech. So I spend a lot of time with Indian ecosystem, Indian startup companies, including some of the government entities. One, I have vested interest in the country, and second thing is I think it's a give back for me to be able to, as proud Indians that we are, that we live abroad, is let's focus on the energy, let's focus on the ecosystem. I think we keep going back to our Y2K models of how do we create a startup with staff augmentation sort of models. And I think the things that you're starting, Akshay, from my perspective, is trying to figure out as this new wave of Web 3.0 and what we're trying to achieve with this decentralized world is what is that synergy, what's the business model? I think that focus is really important. Otherwise, we are happy to bang out code and create amazing demos and amazing time, but we lose out on the bigger avenue and the bigger opportunity that we have as a country. So that's my only message, and I wish you all the luck and continue to support in this journey as much as I can, team. So thank you so much for your time.